If you walk through the grand halls of the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam today, you will see paintings that capture the golden age of the Dutch Republic. You will see Rembrandt's portraits of wealthy merchants draped in black silk and gold chains. You will see enormous canvases depicting Dutch warships dominating the seas, their flags flying over every ocean from the Baltic to the East Indies. The story that the Dutch tell themselves about the 17th century is one of commercial genius and naval invincibility. They were the carriers of the world. They were the bankers of Europe. They built an empire not through conquest, but through trade. Their merchant fleet was larger than the fleets of England, France, Spain, and Portugal combined. They were untouchable. But there is a different version of this story. It is a version that is remembered with pride in the halls of Westminster and with bitterness in the counting houses of Rotterdam. In this version, the Dutch did not lose their supremacy through fair competition or natural decline. They lost it because the English decided that if they could not beat the Dutch at sea, they would simply change the rules of the game. They would use the law as a weapon. They would turn international trade into a rigged competition. And they would strangle the Dutch economy with a noose made of bureaucracy and tariffs. This is the story of the Navigation Acts. It is the story of how England, a second-rate naval power in the 1650s, systematically destroyed the greatest commercial empire the world had ever seen. It is a story of economic warfare disguised as trade policy. It challenges the myth that free markets and competition drive progress. Instead, it reveals the cold truth that empires are built not by playing fair, but by writing the rules in your own favor. And it proves that sometimes the most devastating weapon is not a cannon or a sword, but a piece of paper signed by Parliament. To understand how England pulled off this economic assassination, we have to look past the naval battles and into the ledger books. We have to understand why the Dutch were so powerful in the first place and why the English were so desperate to destroy them. In the early 17th century, the Dutch Republic was the miracle economy of Europe. It was a tiny nation, barely larger than modern-day Belgium, with a population of less than 2 million people. It had no natural resources. It had no great rivers like the Thames or the Seine. It had no vast colonial territories like Spain or Portugal. What it had was geography and genius. The Dutch sat at the mouth of the Rhine River, the greatest trade artery in Europe. Every ton of grain from the Baltic, every barrel of wine from France, every bale of wool from England had to pass through Dutch waters. The Dutch did not produce these goods. They simply moved them. They became the middlemen of the world. And they perfected the art of the middleman. The Dutch built a ship called the Flight. It was not a beautiful ship. It was not a warship. It was a cargo vessel designed with ruthless efficiency. It had a wide, flat bottom that could carry enormous amounts of goods. It had a simple rigging system that required fewer sailors. It was cheap to build and cheap to operate. The Dutch could undercut the shipping costs of every other nation by 30 to 50%. If you were a merchant in London or Lisbon and you wanted to move your goods, you hired a Dutch ship because it was simply cheaper. By the 1640s, the Dutch controlled 70% of European trade. They dominated the carrying trade. They owned the herring fisheries of the North Sea, which fed half of Europe. They controlled the spice trade from the East Indies through the Dutch East India Company, the VOC, which was the largest and most powerful corporation in the world. The VOC had its own army. It had its own navy. It could wage war, sign treaties, and mint coins. It was a state within a state. The wealth that flowed into Amsterdam was staggering. The city became the financial capital of the world. The Amsterdam Stock Exchange, founded in 1602, was the first modern stock market. Dutch bankers financed kings and wars across Europe. The Dutch guilder was the reserve currency of the world. If you wanted to borrow money, you went to Amsterdam. If you wanted to insure your cargo, you went to Amsterdam. If you wanted to buy exotic goods from Asia, you went to Amsterdam. The English watched this with a mixture of envy and rage. England in the 1640s was a mess. It was tearing itself apart in a brutal civil war. King Charles I had been beheaded. the monarchy had been abolished. A Puritan general named Oliver Cromwell had seized power and declared England a commonwealth. The country was broke. The navy was in shambles. The merchant class was furious because every time they tried to compete with the Dutch, they lost. English merchants complained bitterly to Parliament. They argued that the Dutch were parasites. The Dutch did not grow the grain they sold. They did not weave the cloth they shipped. They did not catch the fish in English waters. Yet they were getting rich by moving English goods in Dutch ships. The English called it the carrying trade, and they hated it. The English economic thinkers of the time believed in a theory called mercantilism. Mercantilism was the dominant economic philosophy of the 17th and 18th centuries. It was based on a simple and brutal idea. Wealth is finite. The world contains a fixed amount of gold and silver. If your rival is getting rich, it means you are getting poor. Trade is not a cooperative game. It is a zero-sum war. The only way to increase your nation's wealth is to steal it from someone else. The mercantilists looked at the Dutch and saw a vampire sucking the lifeblood out of the English economy. Every shilling paid to a Dutch shipper was a shilling taken from an English sailor. Every herring caught by a Dutch fisherman was a herring not caught by an English fisherman. The Dutch were winning, and that meant England was losing. Oliver Cromwell and his advisors decided to act. They realized that they could not build a merchant fleet overnight. They could not compete with the efficiency of the flight, but they did not need to. They controlled something far more powerful than ships. They controlled the English market, and they could use the law to lock the Dutch out. In 1651, Parliament passed the First Navigation Act. It was a deceptively simple piece of legislation. It declared that all goods imported into England or its colonies must be carried either on English ships or on ships from the country of origin. This sounds reasonable until you think about what it actually means. If a merchant in Virginia wanted to ship tobacco to England, he had to use an English ship. He could not hire a Dutch ship, even if it was cheaper. If a merchant in Amsterdam wanted to sell Baltic grain in London, he had to load it onto a Dutch ship in Amsterdam, sail it to England, and then transfer it to an English ship. The extra cost and delay made Dutch shipping uncompetitive. The law also required that all colonial goods, like tobacco, sugar, and cotton, could only be shipped to England first, even if the final destination was somewhere else in Europe. This meant that the Dutch could no longer go directly to Virginia to buy tobacco and sell it in France. They had to go through London. The English had inserted themselves as the mandatory middleman. The Navigation Act was not a trade agreement. It was a trade blockade. It was economic warfare disguised as domestic policy, and the Dutch knew exactly what it meant. The Dutch response was fury. The merchants of Amsterdam sent delegations to London demanding that the act be repealed. They argued that it violated the principles of free trade. They argued that it would raise prices for English consumers. They were right on both counts, but the English did not care. Cromwell and Parliament were not interested in cheap goods. They were interested in power. The Dutch threatened retaliation. They threatened to cut off trade with England entirely, but the English called their bluff. England was a huge market. It had a growing population. It had a booming colonial empire. The Dutch needed access to English markets more than England needed Dutch ships. When diplomacy failed, the Dutch turned to force. In 1652, a Dutch fleet under Admiral Martin Tromp encountered an English fleet under Admiral Robert Blake in the English Channel. The details of who fired first are disputed, but within weeks, the two nations were at war. This was the First Anglo-Dutch War, and it was the opening shot in a conflict that would last, on and off, for 40 years. The war was brutal. The English and Dutch navies fought a series of massive fleet battles in the North Sea and the English Channel. These were not small skirmishes. They were clashes involving hundreds of ships and tens of thousands of men. The battles were so violent that the sea turned red with blood. Entire fleets were shattered. Thousands of sailors drowned in the freezing waters. The English had a problem. The Dutch navy was better. Dutch admirals like Martin Tromp and Michiel de Ruyter were tactical geniuses. They had faster ships, better training, and more experience. In the early battles, the Dutch won. They humiliated the English. Tromp famously sailed through the English Channel with a broom tied to his mast, symbolizing that he had swept the English from the seas. But the English had something the Dutch did not have. They had endurance. England was a unified state with a centralized government. It could raise taxes. It could conscript sailors. It could build ships faster than the Dutch could sink them. The Dutch Republic, by contrast, was a confederation of provinces. Each province had to agree to fund the war. The merchants who controlled the Dutch government hated war because it disrupted trade. They wanted peace. By 1654, the Dutch were exhausted. The war had cost them millions of guilders. Their merchant fleet had been decimated. Their trade routes were blocked. They sued for peace. The Treaty of Westminster ended the war, and while the Dutch did not formally accept the Navigation Act, they effectively conceded. The act remained in force, but this was only the beginning. The English were not satisfied with one victory. They wanted total dominance. Over the next 2 decades, they refined and expanded the Navigation Acts into a comprehensive system of economic control. In 1660, after the restoration of the English monarchy, King Charles II passed a new and harsher Navigation Act. This one was even more specific. It listed enumerated goods, products that could only be shipped to England or English colonies. The list included sugar, tobacco, cotton, indigo, ginger, and dyewoods. These were the most valuable exports of the English colonies. The law stated that even if a colonial planter wanted to sell his tobacco to a Dutch buyer, he had to ship it to England first. The English would take a cut through customs duties, and then the tobacco could be re-exported to Holland. This was a masterstroke of economic piracy. The English had turned their colonies into captive markets. The colonists could not shop around for the best price. They were forced to sell to English merchants at whatever price the English offered. And because the Dutch could no longer go directly to the source, they had to buy from the English at inflated prices. The impact on the Dutch economy was devastating. The VOC, the mighty Dutch East India Company, began to lose ground to the English East India Company. The English company was smaller and less efficient, but it had a monopoly on English trade. It did not have to compete with Dutch ships in English ports. Over time, the English company grew stronger while the Dutch company stagnated. The Dutch fishing industry collapsed. The English passed laws that required all fish caught in English waters to be landed in England and sold to English merchants. The Dutch herring fleet, which had been the pride of the Republic, was driven out of business. Entire fishing towns in Holland went bankrupt. The unemployment was catastrophic. The Dutch tried to fight back. In 1665, the Second Anglo-Dutch War broke out. This war was even more vicious than the first. The English and Dutch burned each other's merchant fleets. They raided each other's colonies. The English captured the Dutch colony of New Amsterdam and renamed it New York. The Dutch launched a daring raid on the English naval base at Medway, sailing up the Thames and burning the English flagship, the Royal Charles. It was the greatest humiliation in English naval history. But even this spectacular victory could not save the Dutch. The English rebuilt their fleet. They tightened the Navigation Acts. They built more ships. They expanded their navy, and slowly, methodically, they strangled the Dutch economy. By the 1670s, the Dutch were losing the economic war. Their trade volume was declining. Their merchant fleet was shrinking. The Amsterdam Stock Exchange, once the busiest in the world, was seeing less activity. Capital was flowing out of the Netherlands and into London. The English were not just competing with the Dutch, they were replacing them. The psychological impact on the Dutch was profound. They had built their entire national identity on their role as the world's traders. They were the carriers. They were the middlemen. And now the English had cut them out. The Dutch elite watched in horror as their ships sat idle in the harbors of Amsterdam, while English ships sailed past them, carrying goods that had once been Dutch cargo. The Dutch tried to adapt. They poured money into their navy. They built bigger warships. They hired better admirals, but they were fighting the wrong war. The English were not just fighting a naval war. They were fighting an economic war. And in an economic war, the side that controls the market makes the rules. The Navigation Acts also had a profound impact on the development of the British Empire. By forcing all colonial trade to go through England, the Acts created a massive economic engine. English merchants grew wealthy, English shipbuilders stayed busy, English sailors gained experience. The English Navy grew larger and more powerful. The customs duties collected on colonial goods funded the expansion of the British state. The Acts also tied the American colonies more tightly to England. The colonists were furious about the Navigation Acts. They hated being forced to sell their tobacco and sugar to English merchants at low prices. They hated being forced to buy English-manufactured goods at high prices. This resentment would eventually explode into the American Revolution. But in the short term, the Acts enriched England at the expense of both the Dutch and the colonists. The irony is that the Navigation Acts violated every principle of free trade that the English would later champion. In the 19th century, Britain became the great advocate of free trade. British economists like Adam Smith and David Ricardo argued that tariffs and trade restrictions hurt everyone. They argued that nations should specialize in what they do best and trade freely with each other. But in the 17th century, when Britain was weak, it did not believe in free trade. It believed in mercantilism. It believed in using the law to rig the game. The story of the Navigation Acts also destroys the myth that empires rise and fall naturally through competition. The Dutch did not lose because they became lazy or inefficient. They lost because the English cheated. The English used their control of their domestic market to lock out a superior competitor. They used political power to overcome economic weakness. It was not a fair fight. It was a mugging. The Dutch never fully recovered. By the 18th century, they had been reduced to a second-tier power. Their merchant fleet was a shadow of its former self. The English had taken their place as the dominant naval and commercial power in Europe. The golden age of the Dutch Republic was over. And it ended not with a bang, but with 1,000 cuts inflicted by English customs officials and harbour inspectors enforcing the Navigation Acts. The legacy of the Navigation Acts is still visible today. The English language became the language of global commerce because English ships carried the goods. London became the financial capital of the world because English merchants controlled the trade. The British Empire, which would eventually span a quarter of the globe, was built on the foundation laid by the Navigation Acts. It was an empire built not just on naval power, but on economic control. For the Dutch, the lesson was bitter. They learned that in the world of mercantilism, fairness is a luxury and efficiency is not enough. They learned that if you do not control the rules, you do not control the game. They learned that the pen of a legislator can be more deadly than the sword of an admiral. The Navigation Acts were finally repealed in 1849, nearly 200 years after they were first enacted. By that time, Britain was so dominant that it no longer needed protectionist laws. It could afford to embrace free trade because no one could compete with British industry and British shipping. The British had climbed the ladder of mercantilism, and then they kicked the ladder away. Today, when we study the rise of the British Empire, we focus on the great naval victories. We celebrate Trafalgar and the defeat of the Spanish Armada. We admire the explorers and the adventurers, but we forget the boring bureaucrats in Parliament who passed the Navigation Acts. We forget the customs officials who enforced them. We forget that the empire was not built on heroism alone. It was built on monopoly, on protectionism, on the deliberate destruction of a rival's economy. The Dutch Republic stands as a warning. It was the most advanced, most efficient, most innovative economy of its age. It invented modern capitalism. It created the first stock market, the first central bank, the first modern corporation. It should have dominated the world for centuries, but it made one fatal mistake. It believed in the rules. It believed that the best product would win. It believed in fair competition. The English knew better. They knew that the world does not reward the best. It rewards the strongest, And strength is not just about ships and guns, it is about control. Control of markets, control of laws, control of the game itself. The navigation acts prove that in the arena of global power, there is no referee. There is no fair play. There is only